If you have lived in a town or a village that does not have running water, chances are that you have the experience of drawing water from a river or a stream. Now, even if you haven't lived in such a society, and today you were given this task right now to go and fetch water from a river, there are two things that I know for certain that you would not do. Now, the first is this. I know for sure that you will not take a pot or a bucket or a pan or whatever you choose to fetch your water with that has a crack at the bottom or at the side. Unless, of course, you don't really need the water. Secondly, I know for sure that you will not start out on this journey without knowing exactly where you are going, or at least knowing how the place looks like so that when you get there, you will know that you have gotten there. And if you don't know any of these two, I'm not sure that you will set out without going with someone who you are sure knows these two. Again, unless you don't really need the water. Now, if I were to challenge one of you today to go to the past and to return with authentic African culture as you believe has been lost along the way, are you sure that the pot you are going with has no cracks? Are you sure that you return with everything that you got from there? And are you sure that you know where you are going and you know how you want Africa today to look like at the end of your Sankofa journey? I want to share with you how I discovered and mended my African Sankofa pot. You see, if you are tasked 10-year-old me to present with you a picture of what I think Sankofa should look like, or what I expect to see at the end of my Sankofa journey, this is probably what I would have showed you. Now let me explain. When you look at this picture, you see, first of all, natural landscapes, grasslands, trees, animals. 10-year-old me lived in a world that was full of fictional characters and storybooks and all of that fanciful things. And for me, time and time again, I was presented with an Africa that was full of these landscapes, full of these animals and these trees. But I did not see them in the Africa that I lived in. And so I would have thought that these were what was lost along the way. And this is what I would want to bring back. But even more profoundly, when you look at the faces of these animals, you see some discomfort. And if you know the story of Madagascar well, you know that these animals were animals that had lived in a city in New York and had now been, through some circumstances, found themselves on the African continent and were being faced with lifestyle and culture that they may have found austere and weird. And even though I have lived all my life on African soil, I resonate with them because there are aspects of African culture that leave me feeling exasperated. For example, I was not particularly enthused at that age about having to get along with family members that everybody knew were quite difficult, but still I was supposed to be nice to them. It didn't quite add up. Also, I wasn't particularly enthused that after a long and tiring day at a family function, through long and tedious traditional procedures that I didn't understand, I would now have to serve over 100 guests at a function just because I was not a child enough to be running around, and at the same time, I wasn't an adult enough to sit down with the grown-ups and drink malt. I mean, why? And while you may connect with me on these things, especially if you have lived in an extended family system, you would agree with me that these do not fully present African culture. These do not fully encapsulate everything that has been lost along the way, and there is more to African culture than 10-year-old me would have recognized. And this is true. But what would you say defines African culture? What is it that you want to see coming back? Some of us represent these through the clothes that we wear, trying to wear more African prints to formal and casual gatherings as most of us have today. Some of us also may go to the extent of eating traditional foods at formal or semi-formal gatherings. For example, you go to a meeting with your boss and while everyone is buying rice, you decide to eat fufu with soup. But generally, we all define Sankofa as trying to reinstate and re-imbibe those values that once governed African culture. But even that is vague. What does that mean? How do we practically apply it? How do we see that coming into force in our society that we live in today? We cannot exactly tell. As I have grown, my views of Sankofa have changed, thankfully, from a more cartoonish perspective, and especially as I related and interacted more deeply with African culture. And one phase of my life that really did this for me was primary school. Because in primary school, I was required to study one Ghanaian language. And as is the case in most African schools today, you don't study only the language, but also the culture and the way of life of the people. And so for me, I chose to study Ga. My maternal grandmother is Ga, and I knew I would get a lot of help with homework. But more importantly, I wanted to be able to understand deeply a lot of the things that were done and that happened around me. And even at that young age, I could appreciate that culture as we knew it was passing away. And I wanted to have something to tell my children when they came, if they came to live in a time where culture was no more. Now, Ga classes did achieve this for me. And through the storytelling and as we broke down the way of life of Ga people from birth through puberty and marriage right up to death, I got to appreciate some of the things that they did more. But even as I appreciated these things, I couldn't help but be grateful that I lived in a time where culture was passing away. And I wasn't alone. Many of the people in my class could agree with this, because even though throughout most of the class our faces would be filled with intrigue and splendor, the thoughtfulness of some of the things that the Ga people did, most of the time it was horror. Horror at some of the inhumanities and cruelties that could be covered up with culture. And let me give you one practical example. You see, in the Ga culture, if a couple gives birth to a child, and within 7 days that child dies before it is named, and then they give birth to another child, and that child also dies within 7 days, and this keeps on happening, they are going to suspect that something is amiss, clearly. But this is what they are going to suspect. They are going to suspect that the spirit mother of that child keeps on recalling the child into the spirit world. Now, to prevent this from happening, they are going to take this child and mutilate it. They would scar its face, they would disfigure it, they would make it look different from how it came. And even more than that, they would give it names that reflect how much they do not want it in their society. I'm tempted to mention some of these names, but these names are actually surprisingly common. And so let's spare ourselves thinking too much about what may have happened when we were born. But a lot of people really do feel internal resistances against our culture. And some of us may dismiss it as not being African enough and having lost touch with our roots. But you see, it is these internal resistances that are working against our Sankofa movement. Because if everybody starts off from different perspective of African culture, and at every little internal resistance they feel deviates more slightly from it, this is how our Sankofa is going to look like. Scattered, unpurposed, and it doesn't achieve anything. Now, these reflections of my journey through Sankofa and mending my Sankofa pots have left me with two important considerations about Sankofa. But before I share these with you, I want to share with you the backstory of how I came about them, which, interestingly, weren't through direct interaction with African culture, by reflecting more on how we as human beings interact and deal with rules. Yes, rules. Rules, because rules are a key aspect of our African culture. And if we admit it, Africans are very objective in their definition of right and wrong. And anything you do against any rule in the African society is seen as an act against the whole community. And most of the time, we fear more this angst, this communal attack, than even the repercussions that would be proclaimed against you. Now to my story. In high school, I was privileged to be in a class of fairly level-headed girls. Fairly level-headed at least enough to recognize discipline, even if they do not totally agree with it. And so it would commonly happen that time and time again throughout the semester, we would just instinctively come to this realization that we were deviating from the ideal lifestyle we were supposed to live in the school. We would sit down, we would read through all the rules and discuss them, and would promise to do better. Now, there was this interesting phenomenon which I believe was not just common to my class, but to every human institution that has rules. Tuesday morning, perhaps through Wednesday and the early part of Thursday, we would live very ideal lives, we would follow all the rules, we would be obedient. Simply stellar. But by Thursday afternoon, going through Friday, Saturday morning, you realize that things start to relax a bit. We will show that, yes, we do remember that these rules are there, but we wouldn't live up to it as much as we did in the beginning. Now, by Saturday afternoon or Sunday, you can guess, we would have gone back to default and have reset. And despite this, there were certain rules that absolutely nobody wanted to go against, because if you did, you'll find a class of over 30 angry and stressed out girls attacking you. One of these rules was emptying the bin. You see, no one wanted to come the following day and find the bin overflowing from the day before. And so it was that despite all of this, and despite how attacking we could be against this rule, we could still instinctively come together as a class when the semester got tough to redefine it. We could decide that instead of emptying the bin every day, we'd empty it twice a week. Or we could even go to the extent of deciding that there were certain things that you could not put in the bin because it would get too full. And this was strange, because this is one class that on one hand can easily forget certain key rules, but on the other hand will guard other rules with their life and even yet innovate these rules. And so this brings me back to what I consider about Sankofa. The first of them is this, that Africa must, if we want to be able to bring Sankofa back in its authentic form, bring back the rules. Yes, because these rules, as I said, define us, and these rules make us distinct. These rules are what make us different from many other societies. And even though now our culture is still present, it is the fact that it's not as binding anymore as it was then that makes it feel so weak. Now, the second of them is this, and I think this is an important thing that all of us do know, but not really know how to bring it to bear. That if we want African culture to be able to stand the test of time, we need to introduce innovation into it. We need an African culture that grows as the world changes. Because let's face it, there are more science theories yet to be found. There are more social constructs yet to be developed. And all of these will come against our culture. We need to be able to define African culture in a way that will be able to respond to these changes of life. And how do we do it? It is through something that is common in our African society, discussions. You see, in Africa, when a new rule is to be brought about, the chief will speak to his elders. His elders will in turn speak to the clan leaders in his group. Then the clan leaders will go and speak to each of the family heads that belong to that clan. And the family leaders would in turn speak to every single member of their community through a meeting. In this way, the rule goes right from the very top all the way to the bottom. So every single person has had the opportunity to let their views and their thoughts on this be heard. So that when this rule does finally come out, it is a rule that everybody mutually resonates with. That even if you don't agree with it, you appreciate it, and your views about it have been heard. This is how we are going to be able to make Sankofa effective for us. This is how we are going to ensure that we bring about rules and practices and norms that even the Gen Z African child can appreciate and will not have that internal resistance towards. Sankofa, I believe, is a very powerful idea, one of perhaps the most powerful ideas that have been brought about in African Renaissance. And for me, it resonates with the quote that says, "A single idea from the human mind can transform the world. It can rewrite all the rules. It can rebuild cities." Sankofa may just be that one thing that we need to set us on the path towards self-reliance and strength and development as a continent. But it will not be effective if we continue to harbor these internal resistances against it. It will not be effective if our Sankofa pot has so many cracks that are not being mended and instead keep on getting deeper and deeper. It is only when we are intentional about mending these resistances and these cracks. It's only when we are intentional about having these discussions in our communities and in our groups and in our homes that Sankofa would really achieve the purpose for which it was developed. and that one day we'll be able to say confidently and truthfully that welcome back to our roots and welcome back to Africa. Thank you.